I once had a ship's bell that hung on my porch that had seen the perils of the sea, bombing, destruction, and death. Things I can't imagine. It was a gift from my father, who got it from his father. It rings for others now, but its memories still ring clear in my mind. My grandfather, my father, and I were all children of wars when the great elephant nations of the world fought. My grandfather was a child during World War I when submarine attacks, trench warfare, and the use of mustard gas spread fear across the nation. My father was a child during World War II when his father went to sea as a merchant marine captain, and my dad had to face the fear every day of the loss of his father. I was a child during the Cold War and the Vietnam War when we faced the possibility of nuclear annihilation and watched the Vietnam War unfold nightly on TV. I was never lucky enough to have children of my own, but I've got a couple of nieces and nephews who are growing up during the times when religious fanatic terrorism has hit home. For a child, war is like when someone strikes a bell and you're not expecting it, and its loudness startles you and frightens you, and then the tone settles down and goes on and on. The first time I saw the bell, I'd come home from college to my family home, and it was laying in the living room on a small mount, all bright and shiny and beautiful. Just amazing. I asked my dad where it came from, and he said it had been his father's, my grandfather, Pa, and that he got it in World War II. But that's all I knew about it. That was about 30 years ago. One day, about 10 years ago, my dad called me down to his house in Longboat Key where he had moved after he retired with my mom, and he presented the bell to me, and I was overwhelmed with happiness, and I still didn't know where the bell had been, where it came from. My father gave me a book, Disaster at Bari, and told me to read it, and said that he knew the bell had come from Bari, but he didn't know anything about the ship it was on and the fate of the ship. All he knew is that my grandfather had retrieved the bell from a bombed ship that had grounded itself in Bari Harbor. The name of the ship on the bell is not mentioned in the book, so I was kind of lost. I wish my pa was still alive to tell the story. When your sails are old and tattered, and you come to the realization that you're not taking anything with you to Davy Jones' locker, you have to figure out the right thing to do with the things you have that are important in your life. That's the hard part.
I've been coming to this beach for years. I'd sit on the sand, watch the waves roll in, think of things like girls, my life, my family, the world. I dreamed that there could be world peace during my lifetime. It felt good. When my dad gave me the bell, I wanted to do something for him. I wanted to give something back to him. It's history.
Zippity-doo-dah, zippity-yay. My, oh my, what a wonderful day. Plenty of sunshine heading my way. Zippity-doo-dah, zippity-yay. Mr. Bluebird's on my shoulder. It's the truth. It's actual. Everything is satisfactual. Zippity-doo-dah, zippity-yay. Wonderful feeling, wonderful day. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Sweet Jesus, great teacher, put a black mark on this page of human history. I wouldn't waste my breath on these sharply dressed dandies who started and dragged America into World War I, except that the Belle was a product of the war, and the use of mustard gas and unrestricted submarine warfare figure into its story. King George V of Britain and Tsar Nicholas of Russia, not on good family terms with their cousin, Germany's King Kaiser Wilhelm, started the war to end all wars, which was just a bloody, horrid mess. 17 million men, women, and children dead. Chemical warfare, touted as a humane way to kill or maim your enemy. Chlorine, then mustard gas wafted across the trenches. Even the so-called rules of war prohibited chemical weapons. They all used it. Mustard gas is a particularly gruesome chemical. It burns your skin, leaves huge blisters, and when it gets into your lungs, it essentially fries them. Then you're dead. When the war started, Woodrow Wilson declared America to be neutral, which allowed it to sell goods, munitions, supplies, food to the warring countries and benefit economically from that. That sounded good on paper until the German U-boats started sinking all the ships that were coming to this country. Approximately 5,000 ships were sunk by U-boats during the war. That's the equivalent of sinking twice the number of cruise ships and merchant ships in the U.S. and U.K. today. The sinking that rang the bell and brought America into the war was the sinking of the Lusitania, a British luxury liner off the coast of Ireland en route from New York. 1,398 men, women, and children perished in the sinking by the German sub U-20. Both sides were wrong. The British had loaded her hold with war munitions, and the Germans violated the Hague Convention of 1907 that required submarines to first warn, then place passengers and crew in a place of safety before sinking. Wilson issued 3 memos to the Germans telling them to stop these sinkings. The Germans made coins commemorating the sinking, and a photograph of one of the coins made into the New York Times. America's sentiment towards the war had been changing, and the Brits were chapped that Wilson had not declared war. Bombs that fell as duds in the battlefield were called Wilsons. Propaganda from both sides gushed like water through the Lusitania's portholes. Wilson had to take action, but America was unprepared for war. Shipbuilding went full speed ahead. Build them faster than they can sink them. Thousands of ships were built during the war, and all I had to go on in my search for the SS Editor was the Belle's name, and then it was built in Seattle in 1919. Not much to go on. Suffering massive losses of ships, the U.S. government basically took over the shipping industry. Congress created the United States Shipping Board, which formed a private corporation called the Emergency Fleet Corporation to build merchant ships at shipyards across the country, then turn them over to shipping companies, funded by tax dollars. To help the war effort, private entities would also sponsor the building of individual ships. By 1919, the government had 3,162 ships under contract. One of the shipyards building ships for the war effort was the Skinner and Eddy Shipbuilders Corporation. Skinner and Eddy was the largest shipbuilding company, employing some 13,500 workers during the peak of building. Even though the Great War ended in 1918, there were many ships left under contract, but not completed until after the war. One of the ships was sponsored by the National Editorial Association and completed in 1919. Well, ring the bell, I found her. At 402.5 feet, 6,326 gross tons with a crew of 32 and 6 armed guards. She missed that World War, but not the next. After the war, the major nations of the world met and established the Geneva Protocol of 1925, which banned both the use and manufacture of chemical weapons for use in war. My pa was just a kid during the war, but I'm sure he heard all the stories of the dangers of war at sea. He found whatever work he could during the Depression, married my grandma, Mona. They had 2 kids. my dad, Luther III, and my Uncle Ernie, and he joined the Merchant Marine. He worked hard and earned his way up from cabin boy to captain. And then the winds of war began to blow again. These three children grew up to be quite the demagogues and hatched a plan to take over the world. I'm sure there's scholars who've studied this and have different opinions about the causes of the war and its effect on humanity.
I just know my dad and my pa and my family suffered through it. 60 million people died, and the SS Editor met its fate.
In the summer of 1941, my younger brother and I were living with my paternal grandmother, Edwina Havens Youngs, in Paradis, Louisiana. And our mother had just been diagnosed as having breast cancer. Our maternal grandmother, Mona Robertson, drove from Lameda, California with her oldest daughter, Verdine, to Paradis to pick up my mother and take her back to California for further treatment. Mother declined rapidly and died finally in October of 1941. After her death, it was decided that, my father decided that his mother in Paradis should be responsible for the care of my brother and I. And he drove us back to Paradis. And we lived there throughout the period of World War II. On December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor Day, my grandmother had taken my brother and I, and my father was with us, and we went from her home in Paradis to New Orleans to visit her sister, Mimi Maloney. The announcement of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was made that day, and we were all concerned about the impact of war on my father. That Christmas of 1941 in Paradis was the only Christmas I can really remember from my early childhood. My father and my grandmother wanted to make that Christmas a special Christmas for us, and it was indeed a special Christmas. And Dad figured it was probably the last Christmas during the war when we would have access to nice toys made of metal and that sort of thing. So we had the electric train set, and I got a 20-inch bicycle, my first bicycle. And my younger brother got a pedal car, and we had several other really nice toys. It was, we missed our mother terribly, but Grandma and Dad did the best to make that a special Christmas for us. My father was an officer in the Merchant Marine, and he went to sea shortly after that Christmas of 1941 and was gone throughout the war. He only came back for visits with us twice during the duration. My paternal grandmother was third grade teacher and principal of the small elementary school that was right across the street from our house. My third grade class looked out over the backyard of the school where I could see the Illinois Central Railroad tracks, and I can remember looking out the window watching numerous military trains carrying cargo, guns, tanks, trucks. The major impacts of the war on us in Parody were silly rules about blackout curtains, if you can imagine the need for having a blackout for an air raid in Parody. I don't think the Germans could even find Parody on the map if they had planes with the range to get there. Dad began the war as a chief mate, and subsequently gained his captain's license during the course of the war. You know, we were all worried sick about my father, and we had relatively little communication. My information about the progress of the war at sea came from the pages of the New Orleans Times Picayune newspaper. A progress that I followed with anxiety over the welfare of my father at sea. And when we did get letters, much of the letters were cut out by the government censors for the purposes of wartime secrecy. His first trip during the war took him from New Orleans to California. And in California, they picked up a load of cargo destined for Australia. He made 2 trips to Australia. On his second trip to Australia, while they were proceeding at night along the Australian coastline, Dad was on the bridge with 2 sailors when they were torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. They were the only survivors of the sinking. And they were, I'm not sure how many days they were in a raft before they were rescued, but we were notified by the Red Cross that he was lost at sea and presumed dead. And about 2 weeks later, we got another telegram that he had been rescued and was in good condition. Our grandmother didn't tell us about the first notification that he was thought to be dead. And she didn't tell us about it until she got the second telegram saying that he was okay. So, of course, we were elated that he was still living. On the Atlantic side, Dad made a number of voyages across the North Atlantic. In the Battle of the Atlantic, the principal Allied defense against German U-boats was the convoy system. Ships were gathered together in major ports like New York and Halifax, Nova Scotia, for the transatlantic crossing. These convoys would consist of as many as 80 to 100 cargo ships and many destroyers and destroyer escorts for protection against U-boats. These ships carried foodstuffs and military supplies for England and for preparation for the D-Day invasion of Europe. On one of the convoys that had departed from Halifax during the winter of 1942, their convoy was attacked by a wolf pack of U-boats at night. When the first ship was struck and Dad heard the explosion, he was on the main deck of his ship and he raced up the ladder to get to the bridge and slipped on the ice and fell and broke his arm. And he got up and tried to make it up the ladder, the ice-covered ladder again, and fell again and broke his arm a second time, resulting in a compound fracture, for which he had to come home to recuperate. Fortunately, his ship was not sunk, although there were 8 ships lost that night in the convoy.
I wasn't told how much my family had suffered and given up during World War II.
His first trip home, we were seated at the dining room table for Sunday dinner when the oil companies that were developing oil fields in the swamps surrounding Bari began dynamiting tree stumps. The sound of those explosions shocked my father, and he left the table. The men who went to sea in merchant ships during World War II were all volunteers, and they were very brave men. I'm very proud of my father. I know my father wouldn't want me to say this, but he was the bravest man I ever knew.
I think the nano reason soldiers and sailors go to war is not for God and country, but to protect their families.
By the time my pa left, the SS editor was already in the gale of war.
In another shell game, the U.S. government established the Lend-Lease program, which provided merchant ships and supplies to the Allies in Europe.
The editor, that had been out of service since World War I, was transferred to the British, who renamed it the Empire Dunlin. It sailed under the British flag for a year, and then was transferred to Norway in October of '42 and renamed the Nordland.
Under naval tradition, when the ship's ownership and name changed, the original bell stayed with the ship. A few months before my grandma passed, on the other side of the Atlantic, a Norwegian insurgent ship's captain named Jacob Samuelson and 3 other insurgents stole his 23-foot boat and sailed from Norway to Scotland. The men made the 600-mile journey across the North Sea with a poorly running motor, a sail, and a simple compass, and landed just 6 miles away from their destination of Aberdeen.
Captain Samuelson's escape is one of the most significant stories in Norwegian maritime history. The ship he captained during the course of the war was the Editor, now the Nordland. Like 2 ships crossing on a very, very dark night, my pa and Captain Samuelson's paths would cross 2 years later in Bari, Italy.
On December 2nd, 1943, Dad was on a ship, one of many ships that were waiting outside of Bari Harbor to be admitted to the harbor to discharge cargo.
The Nordland arrived in mid-November, but the port was so jammed with ships, she wasn't able to unload her cargo until a couple weeks later. There were 2 other Liberty ships in port, the John Bascom and the John Harvey, that was moored 3 ships down from the Nordland.
It's been known as a disaster, and it was a disaster. It was been compared with Pearl Harbor.
Peter Bickmore, radio operator, British Royal Navy.
It was a beautiful, wonderful day. It's sunshine, beautiful day. Work was carrying on, ships were being unloaded. A very, very busy harbour. They had to be parked stern against the breakwater, side by side. Tankers with petrol, an ammunition ship was among there. I remember it was about 7 o'clock in the evening. Half of the crew were ashore and I was on the upper deck, and the harbour was fully lit with ships being unloaded. Suddenly their anti-aircraft, Bofor guns on the jetty, they started to fire.
I was sitting with my patient, reading as he dictated to me. About 6 p.m., while I was writing, I could hear gunfire in the distance, which was strange, as the war had supposedly moved further up the coast. I told my patient I would be back shortly, and the other sister and I donned tin helmets and cloaks and ventured stealthily, like a couple of spies, up to the flat roof.
Gladys Reese Aikens, nurse, Queen Alexandra's Imperial Nursing Service.
The lights all went out, and then the flares, the place illuminated. Just sit listening or waiting. With the amount of bombs that dropped, some of them must have gone close to us. The liner ships against the breakwater side by side was their first target. They were the ones where I could remember very vividly exploding. The ammunition ship blew up a terrific explosion. The shockwave seemed to go to the top of us. It then blew up the tanker, which caught fire.
The terrific vibration of the ammunition ships exploding was what had turned our hospital into a glass shambles.
The only thing we could do is to put nets over the side and help people out of the water on board. They were covered in oil, diesel oil and whatever, and they were in a very, very sad state. I well recall men crying out.
The aftermath of the explosion was almost too pathetic and grim to describe.
We were taken by ambulance to the 98th General Hospital.
We worked long into the night and early morning. Intravenous bottles were dripping from every third bed, and corridors were crammed with patients for whom we could find no accommodation. There were blisters as big as balloons and heavy with fluid on these young bodies.
They were blisters from my shoulder down to my wrist.
We began to realize that most of our patients had been contaminated by something beyond all imagination.
Rumours spread, people start to talk, and when it talked about mustard gas, you thought, well, okay, the mustard gas, you die from mustard gas.
Our first thought was that these boys were suffering from mustard gas burns.
You just had to give yourself over to and put your hands together.
The medical officers tried to get through to the War Office in London for information, advice, and an antidote, but none was forthcoming. We were all furious. Almost 1,000 men died in one night, and just as many in the aftermath.
It was the John Harvey that was carrying mustard bombs, 2,100-pound bombs, ordered there by General Eisenhower and Winston Churchill. She wasn't bombed herself. She caught fire when a fuel line on the docks was bombed. The crew was desperately trying to put out the flames to no avail. There was a huge explosion and the ship evaporated. My pa was lucky to be outside of the port, and his ship suffered no damage because the main target of the raid was the port. Pa most likely stood at the helm all night watching the disaster unfold. Captain Samuelson and the Norland were not so lucky.
The waters were aflame and Captain Samuelson and his crew moved to the deck to abandon ship.
All hell was going on in the harbor. Fire underwater and shrapnel falling all over. And when the launch started off to take the raft in tow, perhaps a shade too quickly, both of us having nothing to hold on to. When the raft tipped, we were both thrown into the water again.
Ian Payman, radio operator, T.S. Norland. Here's how it played in the newsreel shown in theaters across Britain and the U.S.
Sensor clearance now releases these pictures of a damaging raid made by enemy aircraft on the port of Bari on the Italian Adriatic coast. A low-level night attack which claimed 1,000 casualties. The heavy death toll was caused by the explosion of 2 ammunition ships hit by German bombs. In all, 17 Allied ships were lost in the disaster. Flames spread through the docks in an uncontrolled blaze. Aviation spirit and high explosives causing one of the worst disasters since Pearl Harbor. Most of the shipping, whose cargo was to supply the 8th Army, was destroyed by 2 separate blasts from the exploding ammunition ships. Some of the vessels remained burning for a week. The disaster precipitated an immediate inquiry into the ineffective defenses covering the port.
No mention of mustard gas.
Censorship straight from the mouth of Winston Churchill.
He let them suffer and die.
The U.S. was secretly stockpiling mustard gas in Europe to use in retaliation if the Germans resorted to chemical warfare during the war.
Apparently, Hitler never had plans to use poisonous gas except in concentration camps.
Had the winds been blowing out to sea instead of into Bari, my pa most likely would have been killed. Bastards. The Norland was burned beyond repair and declared lost. Of its crew, first mate Einar Hansen, third mate Lars Nielsen, and engineer Agnar Gustafsson, dead. British Arm Guard gunner Robert Anderson, dead. Captain Samuelson, after suffering severe mustard gas burns, gone.
We felt so betrayed. It had been kept a secret for 50 years, but those brave men from many countries fighting for the freedom of others, they must never be forgotten. They weren't to know that wars never solve anything.
War is war. I'm just thankful that I'm able to tell the tale and remember those who are not able to.
It was several days after the attack before my father's ship was able to enter the harbor to discharge his cargo. He noticed the Norlem sunk in shallow water and decided to go over and have a look. So they swung over one of their lifeboats, and he took a couple of sailors, and they rowed over to the Norlem. And they removed the beautiful brass bell from the ship and took it back to Dad's ship. And subsequently, when he got back to the States, he shipped the bell to Paradis. When the bell arrived, it was in a wooden crate. It was very heavy. And we took the crate apart, and the bell was scorched from the fire and corroded. And it was my job to clean it up, and it took days to get it back to like new condition. When the war was over, grandmother and my brother and I were in New York City to meet my father, who was in port. And we were there at the time that the A-bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and the subsequent Japanese surrender. He told us the story of the bell after he came home.
My pa made it. Someone once said, in times of war, bells are forged into bullets, and in times of peace, bullets are forged into bells.
When Dad got home, he mounted the bell on a wooden mount so that it was off the floor about a foot, and the bell could be rung and had a beautiful tone. Every chance I had when I went through the living room, I'd ring the bell.
When the war ended, large numbers of merchant seamen left the service, and the U.S. had to continue recruiting to fill the need for post-war shipping. That wasn't the case with my pa.
My father took a position with Alcoa Steamship Company as captain. and sailed on several of their C-3 freighters. He lived in our home in Paradis, and that's where the Belle was kept. My father got his license to pilot on the St. Lawrence Seaway, and he moved to Cape Vincent, New York. Dad had the Belle hung from one of the lower branches of a sturdy tree right on the waterfront, and my stepmother used to ring the bell to call him back home when he was out in the St. Lawrence fishing. After the war, I went to medical school and met my wife, Andy, in 1956. We were married and subsequently raised our family of 5 children. During the years when Dad was living at Cape Vincent, I was in the Navy serving as a medical officer. When we were stationed in Philadelphia, we used to make trips with our 5 children up to Cape Vincent to visit Dad, where the children had lots of fun ringing the bell.
I was a Navy brat during the 60s and 70s. We moved every 2 years when my dad's orders changed. We were stationed in Philadelphia when the Cuban Missile Crisis took place and brought our country to the brink of nuclear war.
Those vacations to visit my pa, my dad talked about, were not for fun. My dad had sealed orders in hand in case of nuclear war. He sent my family to my pa's place in upstate New York to get us away from what would be a nuclear target.
When we were all having fun up at my pa's, my dad was back in Philadelphia preparing for the worst. We all knew the Russian communists were going to nuke our country and kill us all. I remember the drills they had in school. Duck and cover.
Dum-dum, deedle-dum-dum, deedle-dum-dum, deedle-dum-dum. There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and cover, duck and cover.
These children are practicing to duck and cover just as you do in your school. We all know the atomic bomb is very dangerous. Since it may be used against us, we must get ready for it.
We were all living it. I remember one dream from my childhood. I was standing in my room. It was dark. And there was a small window I was looking at. And then a bright flash occurred. And a baby was thrown against the window. And it melted down to its skeleton. I've never been able to get that dream out of my head. If you think children can be shielded from war, you're wrong. At age 5, I knew what war was all about. Fear.
After the world almost ended, I went on to have a fortunate childhood. My parents were loving and generous. Times were good. We got great toys, nice bikes, cowboy outfits with guns, army outfits with a tent, and toy soldiers.
As I grew older, the Vietnam War became front and center in my life.
We'd watch stories on the news of military leaders saying we were going to win the war, dead soldiers being dragged by their buddies and rushed off in choppers, and stories of demonstrations for peace.
We'd all been taught in school that the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese had gotten together to take over the world, and America came to its rescue.
We were living outside of Washington, and we used to drive by the war protesters protesting a war I didn't really know about.
The history books we read in school didn't cover the Vietnam War.
When we were kids, we'd play war with the little plastic army men. They were all the same color plastic, and we'd crunch them together. And I remember once stealing a pack of matches from our house, and we used them to melt the soldiers in our war game.
We didn't know. We were young. It didn't seem right, though, and we never did that again. When I was in high school, the Vietnam War loomed large for us boys who were getting to be draft age. I didn't know anyone in my school that wanted to go to that war. We'd get on the bus after school and we'd all sing, and it's 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't know the damn. Next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7, open up the gates. Ain't no time to wonder why. Whoopee, we're all gonna die.
The draft ended a couple of months before I turned 18. I felt lucky, but I've always had guilt in the back of my mind that I never had a chance to serve my country and protect my family.
One day after the war, one of my brothers and my father were standing in the living room, and he told us that had the war gone on, he would have shipped us off to Canada. I was shocked to hear that from the mouth of a man who had been through World War II, who had been in the Navy during the Cold and Vietnam Wars. I never looked at him the same again.
My father died, and he was bringing the ship down to Florida when he died on board the ship off of Wilmington, North Carolina.
My pa let me captain it once, and it was just amazing. I was captain of the world, and then he was gone. After my step-grandmother's death, the bell sat in the shed for a few years at my uncle's house, and then my dad went and got it and shined it all up again. We had the bell for years and rang it many times until the tone of our parents' voices shut it down.
My dad called me down one day and passed the bell on to me.
I gave the bell to my son Carl because he was an avid fisherman and loved the water. And besides, he was the only one of my 3 sons who was strong enough to lift it.
I hung the bell on my porch, and the weather gave it a nice patina. I liked how it looked.
Everyone who came over wanted to ring the bell. My friends, my nieces, my nephews, they'd ring it until I had to tell them to stop. I had to be careful about how many times I rang the bell because the bridge tender could hear it from our house and might think there's some kind of ghost ship out there wanting the bridge open. When I was 58, the same age my pa was when he died, and after having researched the history of the bell for 5 years and learning of the deaths of the Norwegian sailors, I decided it might be a good idea to donate the bell to Norway. I thought the bell belonged in a museum to honor the dead of the Norlem who were lost at Bari.
Carl was considering donating the bell to a Norwegian museum and asked me if that was okay.
I remember telling him about the idea, and he walked out of the house and came back 2 minutes later and told me he thought it was a good idea too.
I'd started drafting an email to the Norwegian Maritime Museum to see whether they were interested when my dad called me down to the house.
After thinking about it, I suggested to him that he might consider giving it to my older grandson, Christopher.
I never thought about Chris.
I love the kid. He and I share the same love of fishing, the ocean, the outdoors. He's got salt water in his DNA, and he's been catching fish since he was knee-high to a grouper.
I take him out in the boat to go fishing, and he was always the one still casting when I was pulling up the anchor to go home.
Chris fishes, scuba dives, spear fishes. He got a master's degree in oceanography, got a job, and was living out in Houston, Texas. He travels the seas of the world in ships studying ocean currents, temperatures, and other scientific data. He didn't really want to move out to Houston, but that's where the work was.
My dad has always given me the best advice, but he let me make my own decisions and never criticized what I had decided. He told me to decide.
As long as dictators and fanatics force people to disregard the love of their families and kill others who share the same love for their families, I've lost hope that world peace will come before the bell tolls for me. We just have to keep giving that hope and keeping our families safe, which is all that really matters for sailors and children of war.
Aft on the poop deck and walking about, there's the second mate so steady and so stout. What he is a-thinking of he doesn't know himself. We wish that he would hurry up and strike the bell. Strike the bell, second mate, let us go below. Look well to windward, you can see it's going to blow. Look at the glass, you can see that it has fell. We wish that you would hurry up and strike the bell.